Yes, we're back, dear listener. Episode 435. Iron Fist Velvet Glove. I'm Trevor. Over there on the screen is Joe, the tech guy. How are you, Joe?
Good evening, all.
And no Scott this week. You know, we made it to 9 years and 1 week, and he decides to have a week off. Well, he says he's got a headache. Get well soon, Scott. He'll no doubt be listening on this Tuesday morning when he's doing his walk. Right, well, what are we going to talk about? Elections. UK election. Very interesting in terms of the voter share and then the share of the seats. Particularly, it was only last week when I was making the case for proportional sort of voting and that it seemed a fairer way of doing things. And lo and behold, we had a UK election and it seemed to have a very unfair result. So we're going to talk about that. French elections, Fatima Payman, a few other bits and pieces along the way. See how we go. If you're in the chat room, say hello. That would be fun. And, but before we do, in one of these articles that I'm going to go through, I saw a quote from a guy, H.L. Mencken, who taught, for every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. Being wrong doesn't stop such an answer being effective politics. Joe, I find a desire from particularly the older boomer generation for simple answers to complex problems. And I think that's part of our problem in this world is a desire for people to just see a simple solution and not want to see the nuance and the complications and how multiple factors add up to solutions, multiple factors add up to problems.
It's been true of religion. That's why religion is a simple answer to the questions of life. And now a lot of the millennial generation, I would say, like black and white thinking, like you're either with us or against us.
You think the millennials like that?
I think a lot of the millennials I know seem to lack an understanding of nuance.
There we go. Yeah. I think it's a thing that also, if people are on the spectrum in some way, they have trouble.
Yeah, and I wonder, because the people I'm thinking of are what they call neurospicy.
Neurospicy.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, if you've only got to look at the housing problem in Australia, there's 5, 6, 7 sort of elements all adding up to that problem. It's not just the one thing. So, yeah. It's there are complicated, difficult things out there. And Joe, I reckon that I've been reading a little bit about identity politics and versus sort of treating things on a class basis and an economics basis. And I reckon economics is just too hard for many people on the left, and it's just easier to look at an identity that's oppressed and say, got to help the oppressed identity and really just give up on the economics, I reckon.
Yeah, I mean, why look at people's wealth and have to figure that out when you can just look at the skin colour and go, oh, you're black, you're oppressed.
Yeah, so...
Or rather, you're not white and therefore you're oppressed.
Yeah, I think there's a real failure on the left to grasp the essentials of the failure of neoliberalism since Reagan and Thatcher and explain that to people in just a simple, straightforward, economics for dummies type style. There's just way too many people still thinking that trickle-down works, rising tide lifts all boats, and a range of other really bad misconceptions. And even just with money, Joe, I know you were looking at modern monetary theory and just the idea that the federal budget is somehow like a household budget.
Yeah.
Bonkers. But it's not...
It makes sense because that's what we know, and this is MMT is a complete inversion of that, and it's not intuitive.
Yep. Yeah. So anyway, that's what we do on this podcast, dear listener. Try to get into the nuts and bolts of some of the stickier issues. And yeah, okay. Well, that was just a little intro piece I was thinking of. Joe, you're our UK election expert because you're the closest thing we've got to that anyway.
When I last lived in England was pre-Thatcher.
Wow.
Yeah, exactly.
You're that old.
I am that old.
Yeah. So, a landslide in terms of seats for the Labor Party. So they ended up with 63% of the seats. But they got there with only 34% of the vote.
Mm-hmm.
And the votes that they got were less than what Corbyn got in previous years. So there was a low turnout of votes.
Yeah.
And what really happened was that the Conservative vote was split between the Conservatives and the Reform Party.
Mostly,
it seems to be. And as a result, it was difficult for either party to finish up in first place in these seats, and that is what helped Labor gain such a large majority from what was a relatively poor vote turnout.
I should have sent you the video of the old bloke who was saying, well, of course, I was going to vote Reform because, that bloke, he was talking about shooting the migrants on the boats. As he was saying what we were all thinking. And the interviewer says, were we all thinking that? I wasn't thinking that.
Yeah. I saw a guy on Twitter do the math. So there was only a 57% voter turnout.
Yeah, that's fairly poor given that the UK's had 14 years of Conservative government screwing things up.
You would have thought they would be lining up with baseball bats.
You would have. I mean, they got trounced, but there's a lot of apathetic people. Maybe
because they looked at Keir Starmer and the Labor Party.
Well, yeah.
And thought, what's the point? I did see...
My gay friends were holding their nose to vote for him because they've made a number of it was anti-trans comments.
Right.
And they're saying, yeah, really, they've done the small target again.
Yep.
So they refuse to engage in any debates. They refuse to make any policies. And Starmer is kind of almost as conservative as the Conservatives.
I saw this good line on Twitter from somebody who said, Keir Starmer becomes the 6th Tory Prime Minister in 8 years. I'll get on to why. It seems like he's going to be doing further privatising of the NHS. Yanis Varoufakis was talking about how Starmer's employing this guy who was in Blair's privatisation.
The NHS is screwed at the moment.
Yeah.
It really is falling to pieces.
And it seems like Starmer is going full steam ahead on that. So no wonder people didn't want to come out. But yeah, just getting back to the maths of this, only 57% of voters, of potential voters voted. And then if the Labor Party only got 34% of that 57%, you're looking at 20% of the total population. Only 1 in 5 people voted for the Labor Party.
It's hardly a mandate, is it?
And a lot of those people voted as like a protest against the Tories or whatever. So they weren't actually voting because they wanted Labor. It was just that they hated
absolutely not.
Tory and Reform.
And because they don't have single transferable vote.
Yep.
If you vote for anybody else, there's a chance that the Conservatives are getting back in.
So at a maximum, you've got 20% of eligible British voters actually voted Labor. 1 in 5, possibly 1 in 10 if you maximised the protest vote. Joe, is there any doubt that Xi in China or Putin in Russia could get 20% of the vote if there was a vote?
No, probably not.
So when they talk about these sort of authoritarian regimes as being so terrible, undemocratic authoritarian regimes, you could mount a pretty strong argument that those authoritarian leaders could have got the same percentage vote as Keir Starmer did in the UK.
Yeah, I think. I think realistically, the people I know that have come from Russia would much rather live in a shitty political system where you can't be bothered to vote for the prime minister than one where you're coerced to vote for the prime minister.
But I reckon he could get 20%.
Oh, probably, yeah.
Of just, free will voters.
Yes.
There's not a lot of difference between these authoritarian
populism,
regimes and democracies now, is what we're getting to. Certainly with this UK example. So very interesting. So it really worked against the Reform Party. They got 14% of the votes, but only 1% of the seats.
Boo-hoo. Less than 1%, actually.
Yes.
They got 4 seats in total out of, I think it's 800, something like that.
Meanwhile, the Liberal Democrats got 12% of the vote and 11% of the seats. Apparently, the Liberal Democrats were very strategic and very clever about where they worked and how hard they worked, only in the seats where they thought that they could win.
That makes sense.
And they didn't go for some overall vote share. They just gave up on lots and lots of seats because they couldn't spread their resources thinly. So
there was actually a website that was something like Tories Out, which was, depending, you put your electorate in and it said what chance there was, whether you had to vote Labour or whether you could vote your heart, your conscience.
Right.
And it was very much strategic voting just to get the Tories out.
Yeah. So Conservatives got 24% of the vote and 19% of the seats, not that far off. So anyway, as I mentioned last week, I think if you want a true democracy, you would want proportional representation, where if nationally, as unpalatable as it may seem, if someone like Reform gets 14% of the overall vote, then they should get 14% of the seats in the parliament. If you believe in democracy, you've got to believe in it for groups that you don't like, who are distasteful. So someone like the Greens, 7% of the votes, only 1% of the seats. So yeah, so that's how that panned out in the UK.
And Nigel Farage is finally an MP.
Yes, yeah. So yeah, I thought I'd just check how things panned out in Australia at the last election, Joe. So
I was going to say, with what was the first preference vote for Labour and Liberal of the last election?
Last election, the Coalition had 35% of the vote and got 38% of the seats. Labor had 32.6% of the vote and got 51% of the seats. Poor old Greens got 12% of the vote and only 3% of the seats.
Yeah.
One Nation, again, got 5% of the votes, no seats. Palmers United Party, 4% of the votes, no seats. And others, which would be Jackie Lambie and people like, she's just other
various independents as well, I should think.
10.4% of the vote got 12% of the seats. So yeah, even in Australia with our sort of preferential voting, the Greens 12% of the vote, but only 4% of
most
seats.
of the votes go to Labor.
Labor, yeah. So it's really a unofficial Labor-Green coalition of 55% of the vote.
I mean, the theory is that we still have a first past the post, but you can vote your conscience, and hopefully Labour goes, oh well, we've lost this percentage of the vote to the Greens. What policies are people voting on? and hopefully Labour pick up those policies, is the theory.
Yeah. Yeah. Nothing's going to change, of course, to proportional representation until it reaches the point where it suits the coalition and Labor.
No, of course.
At some point. So that's when it might change.
And I don't know that proportional representation is necessarily that great.
Well, it just seems more democratic in the sense that it's a better representation of what the people want. Whether that's a good thing or not is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Like you get a...
Because what we find is the same as the scare of a hung parliament, where the crossbenchers get undue power because they're being courted by both sides to get legislation through.
What legislation can you think of that might have been prevented that we really would have wanted to go through in recent times?
Well, I mean, the classic one was the alleged Greens scuppering of the carbon tax.
Right. So we're going back a fair way.
We are going back a fair... Well, that was the last hung parliament that we've had.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and you mentioned that in Scott's absence. He'd be chomping at the bit
I'm sure.
to chip in then. Yeah. Okay. What else have we got to say about this Keir Starmer? Yeah, ultimately it was such a terrible run of Tory governments and a really poor response by the voting public in terms of switching over to Labor. And arguably it's because they just didn't like what Labor was offering, which arguably is just small target, more of the same.
Very much.
Yeah.
Had it been Corbyn, I think there would have been more interest in Labour.
Yeah. Let's just see what did Keir Starmer have to say as a priority? You know, we swept into power, and you know, you could think about all of the poor people, the inequality, the disasters in the health system.
He's as an exciting figure as John Major was.
So of all the topics that you could think about as your first priority as the new UK Labor Party Prime Minister, what did Keir Starmer have to say?
It is, of course, an important summit on NATO. It is, for me, to be absolutely clear that the first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO, and, of course, to reiterate, as I did to President Zelensky yesterday, the support that we will have in this country and with our allies towards Ukraine.
There we go. First priority, security and defence. For fuck's sake.
Well, unless people are watching the election and going, oh, great, you know, Russia's going to win this now because the UK is going to pull out of supporting Ukraine. I've no idea.
That's your first priority, defence and security. When the disaster that is the UK economy.
Well, at least he didn't say it was stopping the boats.
Yeah, they've apparently overturned the Rwanda issue.
Where nobody has been sent. So,
yes. So that's
who knows whether it was ever going to happen anyway, but...
Yeah. It's like what we got with Albanese. You get a few soft issues, easy ones, and the rest is all the same as what the Tories were offering. So
otherwise the City of London wouldn't have accepted them.
Yeah. People recognise that, I guess. They're going, well, I can't get excited about Labor, and they didn't get excited. So, yeah. Meanwhile, Reform Joe, 14%, populist nationalism.
Yeah.
Yeah. I read something here on Twitter from Steve Reed MP. What is breeding populist nationalism is grotesque levels of inequality. if you look at the areas that are most likely to vote for reform, they are areas that have been completely abandoned for far too long. So Labor's plan to grow the economy, you have to have regional economic growth, so those areas those areas that have been completely left behind and abandoned have some hope in the future. If you have people with no hope to the future, they cling to a misremembered version of the past, nostalgia politics. We have to make the economy work for peoples everywhere if you want to tackle the causes of reform. Sounds like Trump's Rust Belt. And that sounds like...
Yeah, I mean, the seats they won were coastal towns. Coastal towns in the UK tend to be geriatric centres because young people can't afford to live there.
Okay.
So I think they're actually appealing to the boomer demographic.
So not so much Rust Belt in that sense.
I wouldn't have thought so. I mean,
just rusty knees belt.
Probably rusty hip replacements. They certainly weren't the working areas. Wales. Well, Wales was Plaid Cymru because, of course, that's the Welsh Independence Party. So all of the areas of high unemployment in Wales, and then north of England is mostly Labour.
Right.
Because there is England is seen as a divided country where basically there's London and the south, and then there's the rest of the country. Yep. And London and the south gets all the money.
Yep. And does it get all the money?
Or
is it just seen that way?
No, I think it is. I think there are much higher levels of not investment. It's kind of changed. European Union actually helps quite a lot with their City of Culture, which various regional cities have had huge cash injections.
Yeah, so that's the UK. Next election, even though he's got this massive majority of seats, the actual vote was not strong. It could all turn around.
Oh, absolutely. I think if there's a very high probability that they'll get, admittedly it's 5 years, unlike over here. So they got 5 years to turn the economy around, but if it isn't turned around in 5 years, rather than Labour going, well, it was a complete shit heap, you left us and we've only had 5 years and we're turning it around slowly, but we haven't got there yet, the Conservatives will just go, look at how they've screwed up the economy.
Yes.
Look at all the debt we've got.
Yep, it doesn't take long and you inherit it. So it's like Albanese here is inheriting this cost of living crisis.
Yep.
It's pretty much, it's his problem. His baby is how it's perceived, even though the economy is like the Titanic. It takes a long time to turn things around. So, yeah. Oh, well, we'll see how that pans out. Just before we leave the UK, just a bit of propaganda from BBC News. Headline read, 5 killed by Russian strike in central Ukraine. And then 3 days later, airstrike on Gaza school kills at least 15 people. And the difference is, dear listener, when it comes to the Ukraine, it's a Russian strike. But when it comes to the Gaza, it's simply an airstrike and no mention of the Israelis. So this is the kind of subtle propaganda. There's an example from the BBC News. French election, Joe, and so they have a system where they sort of do a round of voting and some of the lesser lights drop off and then they have another round of voting. After the first round of voting, Marine Le Pen's party, the fascist party,
the Rassemblement National.
Thank you.
The National Rally, somebody translated it as.
They did quite well in the first round of voting and were very hopeful of doing well in the second and final round. I think it's done. Yes. And came third to everyone's surprise. And
yeah, I mean, I was talking to Dad about it, I think after the first round, because Dad lives over there. And he was saying that it's kind of what happened with the presidential vote. The first round of elections, people again voted their conscience, but there's enough concern when she gets up in the first round for people to go, oh shit, I didn't really mean it.
Right. And also a bigger turnout, I think, in the subsequent round.
It's the old leopards ate my face.
The what? The
Oh,
leopards,
you're not aware of the leopards ate my face meme?
the leopards ate my face. No?
Yeah, leopards ate my face is the person who voted for the leopards eat my face party. It was after Brexit.
Okay.
So the whole thing about Brexit was people were going, well, we wanted to protest vote against Europe. We didn't want to leave. And then
Right.
were shocked when so many of them wanted a protest vote actually got the leave vote.
Yep. Yep. In the chat room, Andrew said, because in Ukraine it can be either side doing the airstrike. 5 killed by Russian strike in central Ukraine. Okay.
Well, Hamas aren't doing airstrikes.
The Ukrainians could have been doing the airstrike in central Ukraine.
Well, maybe in the Donbass.
Yeah. I think it's always a good idea to identify who's doing the airstrike. So good on them for saying it was a Russian strike in central Ukraine. Perhaps they could have said Israeli airstrike on Gaza. But okay. What did I read on the French one? That that the French centrist and leftist parties strategically withdrew candidates to bolster each other's contenders ahead of the decisive second round. So they got their shit together and instead of stealing votes from each other, left the way open for non-Le Pen.
I mean, the voting maps that I looked at were very confusing because, unlike in the UK where you got very clearly which seat is won by which party, in France it was what was the biggest percentage what was the percentage difference between the two largest parties? So it was just showing how divided the areas were rather than who was winning.
Haven't had a chance to look closely at the French one, but anyway, good to see France dodged a bit of a bullet there. It was looking a bit ugly. So,
And there was a concern that, Europe in general was getting more nationalistic and right-wing.
So that's something positive. A podcast that's had a lot of negative things lately. That's good. Joe Biden in the sort of aftermath of his appalling performance in the debate has had to defend his poor performance, and he's been on some different interviews, and he was on an interview on ABC News where he dismissed concerns about his age, and he said only the Lord Almighty could drive him from the race. Looks like he's going to be staying, Joe.
Well, given the Lord Almighty is a fictional character, yes.
Yeah. Yep, he's there until the Lord Almighty drives him from the race.
One can only hope the Lord Almighty will take Trump from the race.
Yes. Yeah. And he also had another excuse. Let me find this clip where they were.
Well, he had jet lag, didn't he?
Well, and he's been busy. Check this out. He has been busy. This is true what he had to say here.
Oh, I sure had my thing, but I was also doing a hell of a lot of other things, like wars around the world.
He was fighting in wars around the world.
He was busy with wars. That's true. It took his attention. He was busy with wars. That's an excuse for you. Thanks, Joe, for that. What else have we got? A little bit on the US. I haven't had a good chance yet to look at the Trump immunity debacle where the Supreme Court has
ruled
come out.
that anything that was done as a president as opposed to as a private citizen couldn't be prosecuted.
Yes.
So anything that was done under executive order basically was legal.
Yes. Some people took that as being that if Joe Biden issued an order for somebody to assassinate Donald Trump right now, then he would be immune from prosecution under the interpretation under the Supreme Court. I don't know if it goes that far. It sounds like a joke that it could do, but nothing would surprise me at this point, Joe.
Yeah, I think until somebody's actually gone through the legal. Yeah, what's a private citizen and what's a president? If the president decides that Trump is a danger to the US
Yes.
because he was an insurrectionist and decides to execute him unilaterally, arbitrarily,
Yes.
that's a presidential decree. It's not a private citizen.
I mean, Obama spent a lot of mornings looking at information provided for drone strikes, and giving the final okay. Yes, kill that man there. Yes, kill that man. Maybe not that one. Yes, kill those people over there. And then the drone strike would be made and they would be killed. And that was all done as part of national security assassinations. In theory, killing off your political opponents.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's the scary part, is because people are saying this is another step on the road to fascism.
Democracy.
Mm-hmm.
Joe, there is a law which prohibits government departments from dealing with anybody who's using Huawei as in any way, because they're so scared.
As their infrastructure, yes.
Yes, yeah. There's an article in Fortune magazine. The Pentagon has a problem. How does one of the world's largest employers avoid doing business with companies that rely on China's Huawei technologies? So far, the Defense Department is saying it can't. So despite a 2019 US law that barred it from contracting with anyone who uses Huawei equipment, the Pentagon is seeking a formal waiver to its obligations, which bars them from signing contracts with entities that use Huawei components. The rationale is that Huawei is so firmly entrenched in the systems of countries where it does business that finding alternatives would be impossible. And there are certain parts of the world where you literally cannot get away from Huawei. So the law, basically for security reasons, preventing US governments from dealing with any supplier using Huawei, it's the actual Defense Department that wants the exemption.
Yes. I had an interesting podcast this week. Basically, there was a bunch of stolen cryptocurrency that was suspected that North Korea had stolen it. And there was some software that was being used to basically take lots of transactions, jumble them together, and effectively money laundering. But it's a privacy thing. Anyway, the US government has applied sanctions onto this bit of software. How you put sanctions on a bit of software, we don't know. But anyone who uses this bit of software technically is breaching US sanctions.
Right.
And so...
and it's encryption type software.
Well, it's an anonymizer.
Right.
It's not even encryption. So it anonymizes your transaction. Anyway, somebody discovered all this, and to protest the law has anonymously sent $50,000 to every political figure, any public figure that has an Ethereum wallet has anonymously sent the money that has been anonymized through this bit of software. And therefore, various actors, politicians have received money that has been laundered through this system that has been sanctioned.
Surely they didn't get $50,000 each.
Like, no. This 50,000 in total has been traced.
Right. So they'll basically be, under this law, these people are guilty for receiving money that's been anonymised through the software.
It was to point out the stupidity of the law.
Yes. US sanctions.
Yes.
Yeah. Interesting clip. I found this one just a funny one in terms of advertising for US election, just as a little humorous break in the podcast. Have a listen to this one, dear listener. This was obviously a Trump or Republican advertisement.
If you're having trouble sleeping, ask your doctor about Bidenica, the sleep aid made from 100% Joe Biden press conference.
The best way to get something done, if it holds near and dear to you that you like to be able to, anyway.
Bidenica has a patented blend of confusion and forgetfulness that will calm the most overactive brains.
COVID has taken this year, just since the outbreak, it's taken more than 100 years. Look, here's the lives. I mean, think about it.
When they sold out American jobs and killed the Keystone Pipeline, it kept me up all night worrying about how we pay our bills. But then I got Bidenica, and I've never slept better.
Sometimes when I get hopped up on sugar, my parents give me Bidenica so I pass out. Other times they give it to me during the day, probably so they can do the deed. Gross.
Warning, people who have used Bidenica have experienced rapid lying and an inability to secure the southern border. Others have hallucinated and fought breakfast cereals.
Corn Pop was a bad dude.
Ask your doctor if Bidenica is right for you.
I don't think that's a real ad, but it might be. Anyway, it should be.
It's come from Phone News, so...
That would win votes, that one, I reckon. That was well done. Bidenica. Yeah, where are we? We've done UK. We've quickly done French election. We've done a little bit on America. Let's return home, Australian politics. Fatima Payman, that Labor senator from Western Australia who supported the Greens motion. Joe, what exactly was the difference between the Payman position and sort of the Labor Party caucus position and the Labor Party convention national conference position? So Payman crossed the floor to support a Greens motion that called on the Senate to recognise the state of Palestine. That was the motion. Labor wanted to add an amendment which was, as part of a peace process with support for the two-state solution and a just and enduring peace. So the original motion called for the recognition of the state of Palestine. Labor's amendment was as part of a peace process. Now, at the national conference, the most recent one, the position of Labor was put forward as this. Labor supports the recognition and right of Israel and Palestine to exist as two states within secure and recognised borders. And B, the conference calls on the Australian government to recognise Palestine as a state. And C, expect that this issue will be an important priority for the Australian government. So it's a sort of an ABC in the conference position, and B is recognise Palestine as a state. And that was the Greens' motion.
Right, but it misses out A, which possibly is considered a prerequisite.
But it's not contradictory.
It's not contradictory.
Yeah.
It merely misses out the step that says not as a state as in the whole boundary of what we would consider both countries, but as part of what is currently Israel.
And certainly the National Conference didn't put in only after or subject to a peace process. So the caucus was adding something that the National Conference didn't put in its statement. So I reckon Fatima Payman was closer to the National Conference than what the caucus was. Anyway, like I appreciate that, if she went on the ballot paper as a Labor senator, a member of the Labor Party to support Labor values, and I would be really pissed with, I do get really pissed with people who get into Parliament and then say, oh, I'm now going independent, I'm not part of the party that got me here in the first place. Like, I think she only got something like 1,100 votes
Yeah, that's what they were saying.
for herself. So she only got in because of Labor. So it annoys me when people, drop the party and say, I'm an independent. But I'm just a little sympathetic in this case because she was closer to the Labor convention than what the caucus was. So it's tricky.
Yeah.
Anyway, she has some sympathy there.
I noticed that one of the MPs in the UK was from a Palestine. This was for Palestine, he said, and it was all about. It was a Muslim area.
Mm.
My concern would be if that is the plank, if that is the main thing that you are standing for a UK Parliament for, that's not a position.
Mm.
If the rest of your politics is, I don't know, more work for the working people, more support for the working people, tax the rich, whatever, plus you're going, all right, and we think there should be peace in Palestine.
Mm.
But for that to be your main plank just worries me.
Mm. So apparently there's talk that Fatima Payman has been talking to Muslim leaders about a Muslim-based political party.
Yeah, that's not good.
No, but an Albanese came out basically saying that's not good for Australia's social cohesion to have a Muslim-based political party. But hang on a minute. We've had plenty of faith-based parties in the past.
And they've not been good.
Exactly. So, Joe, you're right. It's not good. Having religion as the basis of your political platform is not good unless it's to be anti-religious as a political platform, i.e. the secular party that we all were members of.
But again, it wasn't anti-religion. It was all about secularism. It was separating religion from state.
Indeed.
It wasn't about enforcing atheist doctrines in schools.
Yes. It sounds like Albanese has never heard of the United Christian Party, the Australian Family Movement, the Christian Democrat Party, the One Australia Movement, Family First Party, Australian Christians Party, and Family First Party.
Right-wing nut jobs.
They're all Christian-based. They're all faith-based political groups.
He would have interfered in our personal lives, given half the chance.
Indeed.
And a Muslim party would be the same.
Indeed. It's just pathetic that, we can't have these Muslims organising when there's been a bunch of Christians organising for quite a long time as political parties. So, yeah. Anyway, one of the Greens, I think senators, Marine Faruqi, was being interviewed by David Spears, and she reminded him that the Senate imposes a daily Christian prayer. So, they're starting to object to Muslim political parties.
Well, hopefully they'll pull the Christian prayers out then.
Yeah. To overcome an obvious hypocrisy, Joe. Yeah. Don't hold your breath.
Well, what was the last referendum? Not the referendum, the last census.
I can't remember the figure. For the non-religious.
Yeah. Or even for the Christians. Because it's a Christian prayer.
Yeah.
It was below 50% of the population were Christian.
Yeah. This is from Albanese, who declared that the three driving forces in his life was the Labor Party, the Rabbitohs Football Club, and the Catholic Church. Peter Dutton. Anyone want to know what Malcolm Turnbull's current view of Peter Dutton is?
Oh, I heard.
It's here somewhere.
You also heard about his son?
Whose son?
Dutton's son.
With a bag of white powder.
Yes.
Yeah, I think he didn't ask to be a public figure.
No, he didn't. But given Dutton's very, very public comments about how he was drug squad, and Friendly Geordie's comments about Peter Dutton's possible closeness to people selling large quantities of white powder.
Not you're suggesting anything, Joe?
No. I'm merely saying that Friendly Geordie's was suggesting things.
Right. No, I think family are off limits. I think that was really poor to put that on the front page. As much as I despise Dutton, I think that's below the belt. Anyway, what does Malcolm Turnbull think of Peter Dutton? He was on the project.
They're best friends.
Yes.
What do you think? What sort of Prime Minister will Peter Dutton make if he wins?
I think that's something we should contemplate with dread.
Oh, really? Why is that?
Don't hold back, Malcolm. Don't hold back.
Why?
Well, he's a thug. And Peter's got one tune that he plays. I mean, and it's been all his political life. And that is division and animosity, generally targeted at immigrants. It is real. I couldn't think of anyone less suited to be Prime Minister of a multicultural society like Australia.
No Christmas card.
I mean, there's no point pulling my punches. It's an important question. I've given you an honest answer.
Fairly blunt. Yeah.
What do you expect from an ex-copper?
Just, former prime ministers don't normally bag their comrades of the same party as fiercely as that in public. We'll do it in private.
I have to say that Turnbull was
never
definitely not of the... He might have been an old-fashioned member of the Liberal Party. He's not a member of the modern party.
No, he was old-school Liberal Party, but not the current one, indeed. Yeah. Yeah. Hey, remember we said the other time about the nuclear power plants that so the 7 sites, each with one plant, will contribute 7 gigawatts in total to the grid.
Yeah.
And if you had 2 plants, that would be 14 gigawatts. So
no. So that was if they were the biggest plants we've ever seen at 2 gigawatts each.
Right.
Then 7 plants would give us 14 gigawatts.
Yes, that's right. So roughly sort of 2 gigawatts per
site, and there's 7 sites.
Yes. So that meant that each power station was worth about 1 gigabyte. Let me just read this point from previously. Output for plant sites ranges from 1 gigawatt per plant per annum, which has been the US average actual production, through to 1.3 gigawatts, which is the UK's 2-plant Hinkley Point complex, to 2.4 gigawatts for Finland's 3-unit site. So in the 1 to 1.3 gigawatt per nuclear power station.
Mm-hmm.
And China has recently connected a solar farm, world's largest, 3.5 gigawatt, just in solar.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to hand it to them. They know how to build infrastructure in that country. They know how to build stuff. So, yeah, solar farm, 3.5 gigawatts. And, Joe, it only cost, in US dollars, a tick over $2 billion. Cheap as chips.
Yeah, their labour costs are much lower.
Well, yeah.
Mm.
But still cheap.
It was interesting having talked to Pump Hydro to see the numbers for Snowy Hydro 2.
Right.
Saying it is also over delay. It's late and over budget.
Mm.
Possibly not as bad as nuclear, but certainly pumped hydro isn't going to be as cheap and easy as we think.
But that particular project is a very fraught with danger one, that one, because the soil conditions and what they were digging in terms of the large tunnels through a very large system. A lot of the pumped hydro is going to be much smaller stuff. Well, a lot of it. I mean, there will be some big stuff, but yeah. Yeah. What else have we got here?
And again, I agree that there was something about, even with 100% renewable, we're still going to need some form of peaking as opposed to constant supply, power station, gas power station.
Yep.
I read an article, but there's a possibility of creating green hydrogen. So you take your excess power, turn it into hydrogen, and then you can burn it in a power station whenever you need, and that is suitable long-term storage.
Yep. A mate of mine worked at a power station in Townsville, which ran on jet fuel.
Right.
And when the market conditions were, necessary, then they would fire it up, and it would otherwise just lie there idle. And he would get a call on his mobile phone to, if he was at home, get to work because we're going to fire it up. And he could initiate some of the warm-up procedure using his mobile phone.
Yeah.
So that by the time he got in there, half of it was warmed up, and away they'd go and fire this thing up. So yeah, it's possible to have things like that sort of thing run on hydrogen that fire up as needed. And if the hydrogen's been produced in a green way, perfectly fine.
I also saw Telstra had applied and been granted a power generator license, I think it was. It was a license anyway, because they have so much solar now on their buildings that they can sell their capacity from the grid. So rather than powering all their infrastructure by buying electricity from the grid, they can promise not to buy that or use that energy and generate it internally. In fact, that's right, they were running their own generators.
Right.
Because the cost of them of running their generators was less than the price that they would get from a power company by saying we won't consume this energy for this period of time.
Right. There we go. That was Telstra.
Yeah, so they could bid to not use energy from the grid, and they would get paid for the energy they didn't use.
What sort of facilities do they have where they've got such a large bank of solar? What
all the telephone exchanges. You think of how many buildings across the nation, how much roof space that is.
Okay.
And if you put solar panels on it.
There's a lot of buildings like that.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. There we go. What else did I have? Just depressing stuff about Essential Poll. Number of people supporting Peter Dutton. It's too depressing to go there. The figures are way too high. The number of numbnuts who think that nuclear
it's a
is
serious
cheap.
proposal.
Yeah, and that nuclear is cheap compared to renewables is just depressing. And of course, it's the same thing. Men more likely to get it wrong than women. Old people more likely to get it wrong than young people.
I did hear today that uranium contains about 18 billion calories per gram. So if you ate a gram of uranium, it would last you for the rest of your life.
Is that in some weird forum of people?
It was a meme.
Oh, okay. I just thought it might have been some flat earthers who
No.
took that seriously. Yeah. What else have I got here? I think that's enough. A bit of a short one, dear listener. Yeah, a bit of a short one. There's a book out on the sub fiasco called Nuked, a guy, Andrew Fowler. I was a bit excited about this book, Joe. The subtitle is The Submarine Fiasco That Sank Australia's Sovereignty. And I listened to him in an interview, and he was talking about how we had this it seemed like he was quite happy with the French submarine contract, and most of his criticism was towards the AUKUS arrangement. I hope that's not the case. I'm going to get the book and read it, but because it was obvious to everybody that the French option was just bloody stupid as well, because
if we bought the French option, we should have gone for the nuclear in the first place. I mean, if you're going to go nuclear, you might as well have just done it from the get-go.
Correct. But having a nuclear design and then deciding, well, we'll just pull out the nuclear power plant and put in a diesel power plant was described by submarine experts as fraught with danger and the most complicated thing you could possibly contemplate. So anyway, I will get to that book.
There was somebody talking about, all these cars, can't we just make them electric vehicles? Yeah. And someone said, well, no, electric vehicles are designed as electric from the ground up. The batteries are put down at the bottom because of the center of gravity, and there's so much engineering goes into it. Technically, you can do it, but it's cheaper to build it from scratch as I
was watching this video where they were in China again, electric cars, and basically the driver would drive up onto a ramp and this machinery would come and detach the battery from underneath the car.
Oh, I've seen that for motorbikes in Vietnam, I think.
Right. And then reattach a fresh battery underneath the car, all done within a minute, and off they go. Sounded a brilliant solution for sort of the delay of recharging batteries. At least with a sort of a taxi company, could just have a whole bunch of these just recharging and zero downtime for the drivers who were still in the car as this was all happening.
I don't know how it would work for a car, because the batteries in a car is an awful lot of space. So effectively, it's the whole of the underfloor of the vehicle.
Yeah.
So if you can detach the whole underfloor, it's incredibly heavy as well.
Yeah.
So what I saw was on electric scooters, where you pulled out a cylinder that was, 50 centimeters by 10 by 10. And you pulled this thing out, and then there was a bank of chargers, and you just slotted one in and pulled another one out.
Yes.
And paid your $2 transfer fee, recharge fee. So you basically plugged in your old battery and pulled out a new battery, plugged it into your scooter and carried on.
Yeah.
Which would make sense for city driving. I don't know for highway driving. And again, with vehicles, maybe if you were a taxi fleet, you could have the infrastructure, but otherwise
you wouldn't be wanting to swap somebody else's dodgy battery for your battery potentially. Yeah.
I mean, it's like the swap and go with the barbecue gas.
Yeah, well, that's
because the gas cylinders are only good for 10 years, and so you put in your brand new cylinder that you've just paid because the old one screwed you over and you've expired your 10 years, so you've got a brand new one, and then you hand it in and they give you one that's got a year left on its. Yeah.
Anyway, that's all going to happen down the future, I'm sure. So, right. Well, that's enough for this episode, dear listener. I think you're around next week, Joe. Got anything on?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Okay, very good. What has John said in the chat room? Right or wrong, she will be out at the next election.
Payment.
Okay. Yep. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks to listener for listening. We'll be back next week, probably with Scott and Joe and myself. We'll talk